But we're going to start in 1955. It's a bright spring morning. It's May 1955. We're on 9th Street in Astoria, Queens. And a young lady walks up to the front door of this two-family house in Astoria, and she rings the doorbell. She's dressed really nicely for the day. She's got gloves on and a pillbox hat. And the young lady who lives at home there comes to the door. She's a housewife because that's what they called them in 1955, so don't be bothered by that. She's a housewife. She stays home all day while her husband goes to work. Housewife answers the door, and the young lady asks if she might talk to her for a few minutes about a subject that's probably near and dear to her heart, and that is doing the family laundry. And the woman agrees, and not only does she agree, but she invites the young lady into her house. They sit down in the living room. She puts coffee on so that they can talk more comfortably. And over the next 60 minutes, the young lady proceeds to talk to her about her family laundry. She asks questions very conversationally. She doesn't take any notes. She doesn't even have a pen or a clipboard. She has no script. They just talk, and they converse over 60 minutes. The conversation flows freely. She doesn't ask any kind of clarifying questions. She just listens intently and really makes the woman feel good about herself. After the 60 minutes, she thanks the woman. They shake hands. She leaves, and she walks down the street to her car. She gets in her car, and she has a little form that she has to fill out. She has memorized the entire interview. That was a research interview. She's memorized it all. She captures that in her car. The housewife, that night, her husband comes home. She's pleased with herself, and she tells the husband the story. This wonderful young lady who came to my house today was really interested in me and talked to me about a subject that I know really a lot about. It's my laundry, and I talked to her about that. She was really nice, and it was a great break in my day and in my routine. It was a great experience. So we flash forward 30 minutes, or 30 years rather. A phone rings in the kitchen of a two-family house in Astoria, Queens. And the woman's voice on the other end of the phone asks if she might speak to the lady of the house. So the woman who answers the phone reluctantly agrees, and for the next 30 minutes she tries to get off the phone while she answers the questions that this woman keeps asking and asking. Question after question, and some of them seeming hard to answer and very repetitive. The person on the other end of the phone asking the questions has an accent that's really hard to understand, and she asks questions almost like a robot, very repetitively. She interrupts frequently to ask clarifying questions, and she doesn't really seem to care what the woman in the kitchen there really has to say. She just has to complete another interview. The interview is finally over, and later that night the woman complains to her husband that dinner is late because some woman from who knows where called her to talk about her laundry of all things. The woman didn't seem to really care. All she had to do was complete another interview. I don't like it at all. And the woman tells her husband that the next time the phone rings on one of these surveys, she's going to hang up before it even starts. Flash forward 25 more years. Don't yawn already. I've got 40 more minutes to go. Survey invitation pops up. Young lady sitting in her living room. She's watching TV and she's looking at her Facebook page at the same time. But this survey invitation pops up. It looks interesting. It tells her she can earn $5 if she'll fill out this survey. So she clicks on it. And she begins to speed through the survey, and she discovers partway through that if she answers A for every question, she can almost get through without having to read the questions. But it's boring, and the survey goes on forever. Topic is something she really doesn't feel like talking about at night. It's her laundry. And so after about 20 minutes, she gets tired of it, and she clicks out of the survey and quits. She complains to her husband, who's sitting there in the living room with her, that she's just wasted a half hour trying to earn $5 on this survey, but it really wasn't worth the time. And she swears that the next time one of these surveys pops up on her laptop, she won't even get involved. So why did I use this? I used this story first last summer at a conference that I spoke at in Canada, in Toronto. And I used it there to illustrate that there's a growing risk in our industry of turning people off from participating in the research process as we conduct longer and longer and more repetitive and challenging surveys. And that's luckily not true of everything that we do, but it clearly is an issue. But I use it today because I wanted to illustrate the fact that storytelling can help us sear images into the minds of the customers, the clients, and the managers that we have to influence with our business decisions. Looking beyond the research problem that I talked about there, though, The story also illustrates how the process for collecting consumer insights has evolved, how it's changed over the last 60 years, from door-to-door interviews to telephone interviews to online and to all kinds of other ways of collecting information today. But our role as researchers really hasn't changed over that 60 years. We're still about influencing management decisions, even perhaps more so today than we were 60 years ago. And we do that by understanding consumers in a way that our senior managers and our clients either don't have time or don't have the skills to do. And while our role as business influencers really hasn't changed over the year, the ways that we influence those decisions has changed. The ever-increasing rate of change in our world today and the pace of decisions has sped up so quickly that we have to communicate our recommendations ever more clearly, concisely, and definitively than we ever have before. And that is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. But before we can even think about influencing business decisions, we have to understand four things. The first thing we have to understand is our business or our customer's business if you're working for a client. We need to understand the goals, the objectives, the strategies. What is it they're about? What business are they in? Where are they going? And how do they want to get there? You've got to understand that for either your own company, if you're trying to influence your own company's direction, or your client's company. Secondly, you need to understand how those business leaders that you're trying to influence make decisions. What's important to them? Are they risk takers? Are they willing to take new approaches, or do they like to stick with the tried and true? Now, it's important to understand that, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow that approach. But just recognize, if you go in a direction that's different from what they're comfortable with, it's going to be a little more difficult. You're going to have to work a little more harder to make the sale. Next, we need to understand our organization or your client's organization's business decision-making processes. How do they make decisions? Who gets a vote? What depth of information is required to make a decision? You know, how much detail is required? Our chances of having our recommendations accepted are greater if the proposal is delivered in a format and a depth of detail that's more suited and more matching with that. Finally, and this is where our role really plays out, is understanding the consumer, the customer. That could be our customer, our consumer for our own company, or if you're a supplier and you're selling your service to somebody else, it's their customer, it's their consumer. Who is that person? I worked at Procter & Gamble, and A.G. Lafley, who's the CEO at P&G, makes it a habit as he travels to go into the retail stores and to get into consumers' homes and talk to them about Procter & Gamble's products so that he gets that firsthand knowledge of the products and what people do with them. Unfortunately, many of our own managers that we have to influence or the clients that we have to influence either don't do that or can't do that. And so it's up to us as researchers or insights managers to represent the voice of the consumer to that manager that we're trying to influence. And we do that in three ways. We do that by being data integrators, information translators, and storytellers. As data integrators, and David, I think, talked about, maybe it was this morning, I'm mixing two conversations. David talked this morning, but we talked a lot about how we have many more varieties and types of data available to us today. Seldom are we making decisions based on one piece of information, one survey. You know, we're integrating attitudinal data, behavioral data, household purchase data, media exposure data, government information. We have to integrate all that information in a way that can be applied to a business decision. We have to be data connectors and not just data collectors. And once we've successfully integrated that data, we then have to translate that into a way that's usable by the management. We have to be storytellers. We have to share information in a way that's relevant to the business decision at hand. Theodore Levitt is a marketing professor at Harvard, and he's purported to have said, if the internet is correct, and of course everything is true on the internet, he's purported to have said that people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And by the same token, our managers really don't give a hoot in general about where the information came from. They need to trust us, and they need to believe that they can trust us, that the information that we share with them and the decisions, the recommendations we recommend to them are based on information that's of appropriate quality for the decision at hand. They really don't care about all the details. And then we have to package that in a way that it travels and that it sticks. We have to be storytellers who weave together stories that can move from one person to the other, can travel through the organization from one decision maker to another, and successfully live over time in the organization. Just as life's most important lessons are often best accompanied with emotions, passionate people stories are the things that will stick in our management's minds. What are you going to remember about what I've talked about over the last 10 or 15 minutes? Maybe it's this story of the woman at the door with the hat and the gloves and actually talking in the woman's living room. Why is that? Well, it's an image that sticks with you, and it's a story that you can remember fairly easily. If that interviewer goes back to her office and she tells the Cheer brand manager that she talked to a woman in Queens and she complained about the fact that her laundry was ruined because the powder detergent wouldn't dissolve in cold water the way it needed to, the Cheer brand manager is much more likely to create the idea, come up with the concept of all temperature cheer, than if she spends weeks and weeks kind of digging through reams and reams of market research data. It's because of that story, that understanding, that consumer insight that she got from that face-to-face interview. We've got to be the voice of the consumer in the boardroom. And we've got to tell stories that travel to the CMO and then through the CMO all the way to the consumer in the products that we sell and then the messages that we send to the consumers ultimately again. So storytelling is the first method I want you to think about as you think about how we influence business decisions and how we make presentations. But storytelling is only one way that we do that. For better or for worse, PowerPoint remains like the almost ubiquitous way of presenting information and sharing it. I mean, look what I'm doing today, look what David did. It works for me and it kind of works for David because we're up here trying to teach, and PowerPoint makes some sense in a teaching environment. It may not make sense for that business decision in the boardroom. There may be alternative approaches that you can take. But if we are going to use PowerPoint, we need to use it in a way that's effective, that works, that doesn't bore people to death. Personal observation. I've learned over the years that we too often try to use the same PowerPoint presentation for two different purposes. One, we use it for the presentation. So actually coming up here and talking and what's on the slide. But then we try to use the same deck and we send it out to people who weren't in the presentation. Or we put it on a website or something so that people can come look at later. Well, if you think about it, if we put on the website a presentation deck that looks like this stuff, there's not enough content to make any sense to anybody. On the other hand, if I use my presentation and I put all that content in the deck so that they can understand it, what happens in the room? This is what happens in the room. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to put the people to sleep. So what I've discovered, at least what works for me, so this is a little Don Gloeckler tip or hint, is I simply save my script into the notes section of the PowerPoint deck. Now, since I tend to work from some sort of a rough script, that works for me. I mean, this is an actual page from this presentation, and there are the words that I roughly said at the bottom. And so I have it, this is what's in this deck if I put the notes section up. You've got all the notes in there. When I save it in my archives or I put it on the ARF website, it's there. So somebody can go through this presentation as if they were here. So just a tip, it works, and I don't have to create separate decks. One for the presentation, one for the archive. All right, next, I want to share a presentation that the Consumer Insights Vice President at Estée Lauder, the head of Consumer Insights globally, presented last week at our ARF Industry Leader Forum. Johannes Hartmann had 15 minutes to share 10 principles about his idea of a consumer insights culture. Now, the audience were the insights leaders of marketers and research companies, the biggest marketing companies and research companies from around the world. And so Johannes had to be clear, concise, and entertaining. 15 minutes was all he had. Now, I'm not going to give the presentation, but I'm literally going to show you in the next 60 seconds his slides. And I want you to notice how few words are there and see if you can't get a sense for what he presented. Here it is, 60 seconds of his presentation. Now you have to trust me, but it was a very effective presentation. Few words, except where he felt like he had to emphasize a point. And the visuals I thought were fantastic. Do you remember the diversity slide? I mean, you only saw it for 4 seconds, but do you remember the red tulip in the field of 11 tulips, or of the field of yellow tulips rather? I mean, that stuck with me all week, and you'll remember it next week. If I ask you, what was that diversity slide, you'll remember it. What a great visual. And I think you can tell that there was also humor in there. I mean, you all chuckled a little bit, and you got the subservient chicken thing at the end as well. But this is great. And one concept that I would share with all of you in all of this is when you're giving a presentation, don't start with the PowerPoint deck. Don't even assume it's going to be PowerPoint. Think about what the message is you want to get across. Boil it down to those key ideas, and then figure out where you go from there. And if it is PowerPoint, then figure out the best way to communicate, put it into chunks, and what's the best way to get that out. It may not be any words at all. We saw what Johannes did. It was a really effective deck. And I think some of your ideas reflect appropriate approaches as well. So think out of the box. I'm kind of surprised that somebody didn't come up with an approach that maybe didn't use PowerPoint at all, but that's okay. Maybe there's another way to do it. Maybe there's a video way to do it. Something even more creative. So if what I presented before were sort of the good examples, I want to share maybe some of the bad and the ugly that exist as well. So I would start out by saying, don't do this to your presentation. And if you do it, please don't read it to your audience. This is an actual deck. Some presenters use a rule of thumb of no more than 6 words on a screen. I think that's an interesting approach. I think that's okay. You don't have to do that. You saw David's slides today. I had some interesting pictures and maybe a sentence or something. But I certainly would only use words when it's really important to get a point across, or you really need them to remember the words. For instance, this one. If you didn't have the words plan, do, check, act on the slide, there's a good chance that the audience isn't going to remember Deming's continuous improvement cycle, this PDCA cycle. So you probably have to have a slide that has the words plan, do, check, act on it. But I don't know how you do that with pictures in a way that works. Maybe there's a way, I don't know. But so there may be good examples. Here's another one. Don't do this to your audience either. I mean, that hurts my eyes just to look at the colors, and it's really hard to read that yellow on the green background. Really ask yourself if you really should put light color on a dark background. It's not a great thing to do. Plus, if anybody ever prints it out, it uses just a ton of printer ink. So I wouldn't do that. Here's another terrible example. This is an actual ARF slide. Can anybody in the back row read that stuff? Can anybody in the front row read that stuff? If you got to do this, it's probably better as a handout. It's something you give to the group. But we've seen these. We see these all the time at our annual conference. Somebody puts a slide up that looks like that. Infographics and data visualization are all the rage now. And if you read USA Today, you know that almost every section of the newspaper every day has an infographic down in the left-hand corner. Some are good, some are not so good. I really like the pencil infographic here. I think it's clean, it's concise, and it uses something relevant in the diagram. The other 3 I'm not so keen about. It's just like they just stuck a picture on top of some numbers. So it wasn't much creatively done there. Now here's another infographic, an infographic on infographics. So isn't that interesting? And it's not bad. I mean, it's kind of cluttered, but it's okay. It's relatively clean. I still probably wouldn't use this in a PowerPoint deck. It's probably something better as a leave behind or a handout. But it's not bad. It gets a lot of information on one page, which is often seems to be the case or the objective for infographics. Just as PowerPoint, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's some good and bad, other good and bad examples. This is another good example, and I actually like this one a lot. Kevin Clark used this on our ARF University last year. The planets are segments. The size of the planet is the size of the relative size of the segment to the other segments. The distance from the sun is like the importance of the segment. So as you can see here, the global travelers is the biggest and most important segment because it's closest to the sun. And then they wanted to end up for 5 segments for whatever reason. So they created the Van Allen radiation belt here, and they've got 3 segments that are outside of the Van Allen radiation belt. Still decent size, but they're pretty far away, so they must not be very important, so they rejected those. Okay, it requires a little bit of explanation, but it might stick with in your brain. I kind of like it. It's not bad. I like this one as well. It's pretty good, but I think, frankly, you could probably have gotten rid of the index or whatever you call that down in the bottom left-hand corner, because the sections of the record are already explained. You really don't need a key down there to explain it further. So try to distill it down to something really simple. I don't like this one. It's supposed to be a pie chart, but I think it's one of the worst I've seen. It's confusing. It's cluttered. The 3D stuff is hard to read. The place I got this suggested that a simple list probably would have been more effective. And I think that's true. Plus the font's pretty small. You can't read that from the back of the room more than likely. So it's not one of my favorite infographics. I've studied this one for the past week, and I still can't figure out what it is. It is so busy and so hard. You'd never want your audience have to work so hard to figure it out that they forget why it was important in the first place. And just awful. In my research for this presentation, I found a lot of infographics that look like this. Somebody spent an awful lot of time creating this thing, which means it costs some company a whole lot of money to pay that person to create this thing as well. Isn't it interesting that they have to have a whole key over here to explain the chart? So if that's the case, maybe you don't need that and you just need the list. Why do we go to that trouble? So that's not something I would do either. All right, different direction, going away from infographics for a minute. When I started at Procter & Gamble eons ago, the one-page memo was the primary communication device. You got to remember, there were no computers back then. We didn't have voicemail. You had answering machines and stuff like that. Typewriters were real typewriters. Telephones had dials and things. So the one-page memo, the idea of this was that one page was about all a manager had time to absorb at one point in time. And it typically included these 3 sections or something like that. Well, for today's manager, this is even too much information. And we've got to reduce our recommendations even further to the few bullet points, the few key ideas. We're the insights experts. And so it's got to be us that takes the burden of translating and distilling data down to a few key pieces of information, a few key points. Now, if that counts for a presentation, it counts double for an email. So as we send email out, it's got to be really simple. Here's a sample email. In today's world, we've got how many emails are going to be in your mailboxes when you get back to work or when you open your phone up. You don't want to think about it. It's a big number. You're shaking your head back there. I know what mine's going to look like. So if we expect them to read it, we got to cut it down to just the information that they need, especially if you're communicating some kind of a recommendation to senior management. Keep it really, really simple. One other important comment to make, and it's on language. Hardly a day goes by that one of us doesn't communicate with someone for whom English is not their primary, their first language. Often we're dealing with people, many people, for whom English is their second language, and maybe their primary languages are different around the table. So it's important for us to use common terminology when we present, and to not use slang and colloquialisms that are hard to understand. Another thing I've noticed is that we're on the telephone with conference calls frequently. You got to be careful for things like numbers. 30. Was that 30 or was that 13? 30, 30, 13, 13. Go to that extent to make sure you're communicating clearly, especially if you're making a recommendation and you're doing it on the telephone. So keep that in mind. Who's my audience? What's their language? And what am I trying to communicate, and how clear am I being? So, there are some ideas today on how to influence decisions, storytelling, careful use of PowerPoint, including strong visuals. There's that tulip again. Just a few words and bullet points, infographics, clear, concise email. And then the last thing you want to do if you're presenting is leave time for Q&A. I didn't do that. We're out of time. We don't have time for Q&A. But it's really important to plan that. We'll get this deck to you. I've included an appendix with some other pieces of advice. What happens if the computer doesn't work and you got to present without it? So you better have a hard copy of your deck in your hand, or something to hand out. Just things like that. So we'll post the deck. It'll be available. And if you have any questions, I'll be here all afternoon, and you can always send me an email. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.